Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our JLARC meeting for June. And I would like to go ahead and call our meeting to order as soon as Mark Obenshain decides to take a seat. And I do believe that we have one person on, is it just one person online? Senator McDougal is online, and I think everyone else is here. Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started, and Hal, you can go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. I'd like to extend a special welcome this morning to Senator Obenshain, who is our newest Senate member, and this is his first meeting he's been able to join us, so welcome. Madam Chair, we have an unusually short agenda this morning. First, JLARC staff will present the findings from the latest in-depth review of economic development incentives. Then the Auditor of Public Accounts and her deputy will discuss key findings from their recent audit work. And Madam Chair, first up is the incentives review. For our new members, the Appropriation Act gives JLARC responsibility to evaluate the state's economic development incentives on an ongoing basis. As part of this effort, each year we present two reports to you. One is an in-depth evaluation of a subset of incentives, typically focused on a particular theme, and that's what we're presenting to you today. We also provide you with a second report in November, which is a much higher level overview of all the state's economic development incentives. Today's report is an in-depth review of the state's film, media, and tourism incentives. We partner with economists at UVA who have expertise in economic impact analysis and modeling to conduct our reviews. Terry Rappan, who is a regional economist with UVA's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, led the economic impact analysis for this review and is here today to help answer technical questions that you may have. Finally, I want to thank Virginia Tax, Virginia Film Office, Virginia Tourism Corporation, and the Virginia Department of Aviation for their assistance in this review. Kimberly Sarte oversaw the review and will join Terry at the table during today's presentation. Ellen Miller was the lead JLARC analyst for this review and will be presenting the findings this morning. Ellen?
Thank you, Hal. Good morning, Madam Chair and members. As Hal mentioned, my name is Ellen Miller, and I'll present our findings on our evaluation of Virginia's film, media, and tourism incentives. Slide 2 describes the mandate for the incentive evaluations. This report is our 10th in-depth evaluation, and all 10 other evaluation categories are listed here on this slide. This is actually the second time we've looked at the film incentives. Starting with next year's report, we will review select economic development incentives and also incorporate other large incentives into our review based on feedback from the study subcommittee, JLARC study subcommittee. For this particular report, we focused on 6 incentives in our evaluation. The largest is the Tourism Development Financing Program, and it's the largest program primarily for one project that it supported. The next largest incentive is the Media Provider Equipment Exemption, and it's second largest because it was recently expanded to include broadband equipment. The next 3 incentives are all film-related: the Motion Picture Production Tax Credit, the Governor's Motion Picture Opportunity Fund, and a sales tax exemption. The last incentive is the Governor's New Airline Service Incentive Fund, and this program was adopted in 2020. Slide 5 lists our key findings. We found that film activity supported by the film incentives varied widely from year to year, making it difficult for the state to develop a sustainable film industry. The Tourism Development Financing Program addresses lodging deficiencies and has high economic benefits and return in state revenue. The Governor's New Airline Service Incentive Fund has no influence on airline service decisions and negligible economic benefits, but it may contribute to the success of new airline service by supporting marketing efforts. The Media Provider Equipment Exemption generates negligible economic benefits, but may have other public benefits. My presentation this morning is split into 5 sections, and I'll start with 4 sections, and I'll start with the film incentives. So Virginia offers 3 incentives to attract film and TV productions to Virginia. The film tax credit is refundable, and the base credit is valued at 15% of eligible filming expenses in Virginia. No more than $6.5 million in tax credits can be allocated to taxpayers per year. The grant is made at the governor's discretion using guidelines developed by the Film Office, and these guidelines are similar to the eligibility requirements for the tax credit. In fact, the tax credit and grant are often used in conjunction with each other. The film tax exemption is the smallest of the 3 and allows productions to purchase items used during filming without paying retail sales and use tax. The film tax credit is the largest of the 3 incentives, followed by the film grant. These 2 incentives were used to attract 42 film or television productions between fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 24. We found that incentivized film activity in Virginia has fluctuated significantly each year, making it difficult to develop a sustainable film industry. And that's because the fluctuation or volatility in film production activity has made it difficult for the state to retain experienced film crews, specialized vendors, and soundstage infrastructure. While Virginia's film industry has grown some, this volatility has likely limited its growth, and Virginia's film industry still represents only about 1% of total film employment across the U.S. So to illustrate the fluctuation, slide 12 assigns film tax credit awards to the year that the film was produced. And this really highlights the variation in film production activity, as you can see. Awards by production peaked in fiscal year 20, when several large projects were produced in Virginia, including Swagger, The Walking Dead, The World Beyond, The Good Lord Bird, and Dopesick. Most of these productions received film tax credit awards in fiscal year 19. So altogether, $36 million in tax credits were awarded in fiscal year 19. Large awards in one year like this affect the ability of the Film Office to make future tax credit awards. So you may wonder how $36 million in credits were awarded when the cap is $6.5 million. This was possible because the cap applies to how credits are allocated, and the Film Office can allocate tax credits over multiple years as long as the total amount allocated across taxpayers is at or below the cap. So for example, one production received more than $10 million in tax credit awards in fiscal year 19, but the awards were allocated over 3 years starting in fiscal year 22. Because of the large fiscal year 19 awards, no awards were made in several subsequent years, and that's because if credits had been awarded, they would have had to be allocated several years out. We found that the economic benefits of film incentives vary. The film grant has moderate economic benefits, the tax credit has low economic benefits, and the sales tax exemption has negligible economic benefits, and this is when compared to other economic development incentives. So if you look at the first column, you'll see that the economic benefits range from moderate to negligible based on the shading of the circles. So in terms of economic benefits, we are looking at measures like the increase in job creation for every $1 million spent on the incentive so that the results are comparable across incentives that vary in size. And Delegate Reed, you had asked at the work plan meeting if we look at the indirect and induced benefits when we do the analysis, and that information is baked into this information. We also look at the return in state revenue for every $1 spent on the incentive, and the right column shows that the returns are moderate or low depending on the incentive. We compare the economic benefits and returns and revenue across all incentives so that and that's why we say the film grant is moderate, because its economic benefits are similar to the average incentive. The film tax credit is low because it is lower than the average incentive, and the exemption is much lower. So just for context, what are the economic benefits and return in the revenue for the average incentive? The average incentive generates 58 jobs, $9 million in GDP, and $5 million in personal income per $1 million spent, and 41 cents per $1 spent in terms of the return in revenue. So again, this is the second time we have reviewed the film incentives. In developing recommendations to improve them, we focused on how to help Virginia develop a stronger film industry with more consistent production. We focused on the tax credit because the Film Office indicates it's the industry's preferred incentive, mainly because it is predictable since it's not subject to appropriations like the grant. Research indicates that while film incentives do impact film location decisions, the boost provided to the economy is temporary, which leads me to the first change, and that's to adopt a bonus 5% tax credit for television series that commit to filming a second and subsequent seasons. These are the productions that will have a longer-term impact and on having a sustainable industry. The other change is to adopt a formal allocation method to allocate credits across multiple years based on the size of the award. Spreading out the awards would enable the Film Office to continue to attract sizable productions like a TV series, provide more predictability in award allocations, and prevent productions from having to potentially wait several years to begin claiming their tax credits. So this slide lists a potential allocation method that you could consider, and it's based on one that was used in New York. Slide 17 lists our recommendations that the General Assembly may wish to consider adopting a bonus tax credit for multi-season productions and a formal tax credit allocation method. We do not have a formal recommendation for the film exemption, but we do note in the report that it expires July 2027. The General Assembly could allow it to expire because it is not important to film location decisions and it generates negligible economic benefits. However, the Joint Subcommittee to evaluate tax preferences could examine the exemption and potentially reallocate the funding to one of the other film incentives. And Madam Chair, I'll pause here to see if there are any questions before I turn to the next
Are
section.
there any questions? I believe Senator Dees has a question.
On slide 16, you said that program is based on something in New York. What I was wondering, how do you get a television series to commit to film multiple seasons when they are subject to, I guess, viewership that might be canceled after one season? Would it still apply, the tax credit?
So are you talking about the bonus?
Yes.
So they would only get the bonus in the second year. So if they only film in one season, they would get the base credit. There are other bonus credits that aren't related to multi-season that they could qualify for.
Madam
So
Chair.
in the second year, they could get the base again and the bonus if they otherwise qualify.
And Madam Chair,
Senator Dees.
that's what New York does, and what's the result of that?
So that one, the formal allocation method is what New York did. I'm not sure to what extent they had a bonus off the top of my head.
Okay.
Believe
Thank
it or
you.
not, Delegate Reed has a question.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair. So thanks for answering the first question. And Madam Chair, I do have kind of two related questions. One is that on slide 11, you had indicated that the volatility in the film activity in our amount that we set aside actually prevents the development of kind of a sustainable industry here in Virginia. And so therefore it's difficult to retain experienced crews. And so because we've had this great variation over time. So did you take into account, or did any of your analysis actually identify that it's like how much could we increase the workforce if we had a stable commitment to the film incentive program? So that's the first question. And then I know in the report that you did, and it's not included here in the slides, but in the report you had some indications of how other states are committing more and therefore they're generating a more stable long-term workforce. So my second question is, when do you get, or when would we get to the tipping point of saying, okay, once we've invested this amount on an ongoing basis, we actually would establish a long-term industry?
Thank you, Delegate Reed. Okay, so I'll try to take the first question, or first part of your question, if I remember it correctly. Basically, you were asking how much would it take to...
It's really a question about us providing stable funding, because right now we don't provide a stable amount of funding, and so therefore I'm assuming that it makes it difficult for us to market Virginia to the film industry, and therefore we don't create a long-term workforce.
Right, and I think the answer to that, we didn't specifically look at like how much it would take to get a stable workforce, but I think you would see that happen. And I don't know exactly like what, one particular film may require more employment than another. But I think what you would see over time, if Virginia could at least fund one or two films, you would not see like the exodus of film employment that has been happening recently.
And Madam Chair, it's because what I'm looking at is on slide number 12, you see that we had a consistent amount, and then we had a peak of some filming that was done, and then because we had that peak, we then had to spread that out, which meant that we weren't able to like do anything new. So we're not able to develop a long-term workforce. And so that's what I'm trying to get at is like, is there an analysis that says what's the right number for consistency that would incentivize the industry to come here on a regular basis, and we would develop homegrown talent as well?
So what's the right tax credit amount?
Yes.
Well, I think that would depend on how much you're, willing, like how many films do you want, or how many television series do you want at a time, and how much you want to spend. I would say the average, the average film, like a TV series, is probably around 8 or 9 million for one episode in terms of the tax credits that it has been awarded recently.
And that then bleeds into the other question about like what are our competitor states doing?
So it varies. So some have uncapped credits. For example, Georgia, their credit is uncapped, and they've spent like $1 billion in a year just on the credits. And granted, they do have a bigger film employment level than Virginia does, but they are still far behind, like California, for example, in New York. So I would certainly caution against spending anything like that. Other states are higher. Some are in the 20, 30 range. Some are, closer to the 100 million range. So it really does vary. But Virginia, to your point, is, toward the more moderate in terms of how much is offered. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate, one other point that may be worth considering as well is that, as Ellen mentioned, these the effects are temporary. So when the production leaves, the workforce leaves. And so one thing to keep in mind is the state could put more money into the film incentives, but the state could also put more funding into other incentives for like manufacturers or something where you have kind of, even after they're done receiving the incentive, potentially they still have a workforce in place. So that's something to keep in mind as well when considering how much Virginia wants to allocate to these types of incentives.
Madam Chair. The other one.
Knocked yourself out. I will go to you anyway. Delegate Thomas and then Delegate Herring.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I just have one question with no follow-ups or add-ons. I'm actually from the part of Georgia where the film industry settled. I grew up there for all 18 years, and so I got to see this change firsthand. However, my question is, I'll ask the question first and tell you why, Madam Chair. My question is there any state that's ever really achieved a significant capture of market share of new film jobs from New York or California? The reason I ask that is, roughly California spends about $750 million and still retains 40 to 50% of the job market share. New York spends $900 million as of latest estimates, with 18 to 20%. My home state of Georgia has spent over $1 billion for the last many years, and Fayette County is where I'm from and where this facility is, and yet, on a good year, they have still only captured 6%. And so I'm having trouble as to why Virginia would have a program at all. Is there any state that has devoted any amount of money that's not California and not New York and achieved anything better than 6%?
That's a good question, Delegate Thomas. And so just to back up on a little bit of history, so California at one time did not have film incentives at all, and most of the production was in California. California has begun to offer incentives within the last several years because film employment was leaving their state for other states, as well as going outside of the U.S. to Canada, and the UK. So, no, that is a great question. If Virginia wants a film industry, then what our report is recommending that, you can keep the funding where it is. You can increase it a little bit to keep pace with inflation. Because it hasn't changed since 2015. And to better, to spread out the volatility, you can develop a formal allocation method. Again, as Kimberly pointed out, we don't recommend spending anywhere close to Georgia, for example, or really a lot more, and for the reasons that she mentioned. When production ends, the economic benefits essentially end. One way to stretch them out a little bit longer is to fund TV series, and that's why we include references to those, and specifically the bonus credit for TV production.
Did you have your follow-up, or should we move on?
No, Madam Chair, rounds complete.
Harry?
Thank you,
Senator
Madam
Deeds.
Chair. And this is just a comment, and first of all, thank you for the study. My concern and why I kept carrying the tax credit bill is because, our film office is actually at risk of closing for not enough funding. If you look at Maryland, $25 million cap, like you said, North Carolina, $33 million. It is my belief that Virginia just needs to at least be competitive. I know that there were 2 projects that the film office were actually trying to get. I don't know where we are on that for this year, but recently there was a project that we lost to another state, but the project, it was about our history and a Virginian. And so I just really would like us to make sure that we're telling our stories, benefiting our economy, providing opportunities for independent businesses that help support, whether it be a catering business, costume design, and support that industry. So thank you for your recommendations, and I'm very interested in the, I was cut off. All good. Interested in the TV series. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Deeds.
I apologize. I've tried to pay attention, but I want to make sure that I understand the answer to Delegate Thomas's question.
Sure.
The answer is no. There aren't any states that have achieved positive economic benefit on revenue stream because of the tax incentives.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we can move on.
Okay. My next section covers the Tourism Development Financing Program. So this program is different than most incentives that we look at because it is a gap financing program rather than a tax incentive or tax credit or a grant. This program supports large-scale tourism projects that lack private financing. It's geared toward projects addressing lodging deficiencies, and during our study period, 9 projects were approved. The gap finance portion debt for the program is shared by the state, the locality, and the developer, and the state's portion for these projects is $95 million. The debt is repaid based on a portion of the state retail sales tax revenue that is generated by the project. The amount of gap financing and the portion of sales tax on which the repayment is based is determined by the project size. Slide 21 shows that projects are categorized into 3 tiers based on the capital investment associated with the project. So a project under $100 million is classified as Tier 1, which means the gap financing for the project can be up to 30% of the project cost, and the repayment amount is 1% of state retail sales taxes collected by the project. Slide 22 shows that projects have been dispersed around the state, and you can see that projects vary from smaller boutique hotels, such as the Wayanoke Hotel in Farmville, to large resorts like Kalahari in Spotsylvania, and it also includes a wellness retreat in the Shenandoah Valley. We found that projects supported by the Tourism Development Financing Program address lodging deficiencies and also have other benefits. Projects have mostly focused on high-end lodging because Virginia's lodging deficiencies are most pronounced in this area because of outdated, insufficient, or poorly aligned accommodations relative to current visitor demand. And it's visitors to these high-end lodging facilities that are also likely to be aligned with higher tourist spending. Projects have also contributed to downtown revitalization and preservation because several hotels have involved renovating and rehabilitating historic or unused properties. We found that the program has high economic benefits per $1 million spent on the incentive and a high return in state revenue relative to other economic development incentives. And these results, the economic benefits and return in revenue are listed on slide 26. And they are considered high because they are higher than the economic benefits and return in revenue for the average incentive. Based on stakeholder input that the sales tax remittance process for the program is cumbersome, the process could be reviewed to determine if it could be less burdensome. Sales tax collections are certified by the state on a quarterly basis, and then repayment is issued by the state, the locality, and the developer. Both localities and lenders reported the process is burdensome in terms of the paperwork required, and especially because of frequent staff turnover. The Tourism Corporation, Virginia Tax, and Department of Accounts are all involved in the remittance process and could take steps to reduce the administrative burden. This may entail developing more administrative guidance or recommending changing the frequency of the remittance. The Tourism Corporation should also review the program's tier structure and possibly recommend modifying it. Right now, there are 3 tiers, and they are based on project size. However, we found that most projects are similar in size and their financing need. 6 of the 9 projects had capital investment amounts less than $100 million, meaning they would fall into Tier 1. 6 also needed only a small amount of gap financing. The second thing we found is that project rates of return varied and have no clear association to the gap financing share. And slide 29 provides examples of this lack of association. So for example, if you look at Kalahari Resort and the Cavalier Hotel, they have the same average annual rate of return at 5%, but they have very different gap financing shares. Slide 30 lists our recommendations for the Tourism Corporation to examine opportunities to improve the remittance process and the tier structure, and then report their findings and any recommended statutory changes to the Money Committees and House Finance Chairs by November 2027. Another change we identified is that projects should be required to meet a minimum level of out-of-state visitation, which currently does not have this requirement. Out-of-state visitors are important for the economic impact of the program, just like tradable businesses are for other economic development incentives. Out-of-state visitors and tradable businesses are what brings new money into the state. We also found from a survey of recipients that an estimated 43% of visitors for tourism development projects were out of state on average. Slide 32 lists our recommendation to consider requiring projects meet a minimum percentage of out-of-state visitation. And I'll pause there, Madam Chair, to see if there's any questions.
Are there any questions on this section? Surprise, surprise. Delegate Reed.
Madam Chair, thank you. On slide 20, you had identified that the gap financing is shared by the state, the locality, and the developer and repaid over a 20-year period. And how does the developer repay their portion of this? And what happens if the developer goes under during that 20-year repayment period?
Okay, so each of the shares are basically set based on the sales tax collection for the quarter. So depending on the tier, it could be 1% of the sales tax collections or up to 2%. So once that is determined, the state uses the revenue that it generates from the project and forks over the 1% or 2% or whatever. Whatever that amount is, the locality pays the same amount and the developer pays the same amount. So what happens if the developer, so where does the money come from the developer? Wherever it gets revenue. But what happens if the developer goes under and stops paying? So basically, the state does not have to cover the developer's share, nor does the locality. The developer is ultimately at risk. Absorbs all the risk for the financing of the program. So if the project closes down, if the hotel shuts down, the state is not generating any revenue, the state doesn't pay, the locality doesn't pay, and the developer has to figure out how to pay, essentially.
Are there questions on this section?
Okay. Moving along to the Governor's New Airline Service Incentive Fund. So this grant was adopted in 2020 and made its first awards in 2022. Through fiscal year 24, it awarded $340,000 for 18 new routes at Virginia airports. The grants are relatively small and they provide financial assistance for marketing and promotional efforts. Most of the new routes have been established at Norfolk and Richmond airports, though some have been at Dulles and Reagan National. We found that the grant has no influence on Virginia Air Service decisions, but it may help with new route success. The grant has no influence because it is small relative to route startup costs and subsidies from either the federal government or from the airports themselves. It is also small compared to the extensive approval process, which requires documentation of about 10 criteria and multiple levels of approval. So it has to be approved by 3 different secretariats. Department of Aviation staff, however, indicate the grant helps improve the success of a new route by increasing public awareness of the route through the marketing and the promotional activities. We also found the grant has negligible economic benefits and returns in state revenue compared to other incentives. And you'll see that on slide 38, Compared to the average incentive, these benefits and returns are much, much lower. So you may recall that only $340,000 has been spent on this grant so far, but we say, this is what was created per 1 million. Basically, we just calculate a ratio, sort of like a population ratio. And so for this particular incentive, it's if the grant had spent $1 million, you would expect to get about 4 jobs in return. The General Assembly can consider eliminating the new airline service grant, mainly because it has negligible economic benefits and limited influence on airlines' decisions to establish new routes. Another reason is the broad economic, airline industry, and regional demographic trends have much more influence on air service decisions than a small grant. And slide 40 lists the policy option for the General Assembly to consider eliminating the grant. On the other hand, there may be some reasons you want to keep the grant, mainly for symbolic reasons, because it does show support for commercial air service, and it does help to market new routes and ensure that they're successful. So we feel that if you do maintain the grant, the approval process should be streamlined so that it does not have to go through 3 secretariats. And consideration could also be given to broadening the eligibility criteria and allowing it to be used for service retention and increasing flight capacity or frequency, not just right now, it's focused mainly on new routes. Slide 42 has the recommendation for the Department of Aviation to develop a streamlined approval process that aligns better with the award size. And 43 lists the policy option for the General Assembly to consider expanding eligibility for the grant. And I'll pause here, Madam Chair, for any questions on that section.
Delegate Reed.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the input on this because, again, it seems like it's really very bureaucratically burdensome to be able to award such a small one. I wanted to ask the chair if it would be okay if I ask a question of Director Campbell, because I see him sitting there in the audience, and I was curious whether or not there are already initiatives underway to streamline this cumbersome bureaucratic process, and if he or Ms. Miller could give us an example of how this is being used, because I know that you kind of implied that it could be used to show state intent, and I was just curious if there was an example that we could borrow from.
Sure. Do you want me to answer part of it first?
If he doesn't mind being put on the spot like that.
Not at all. Not at all. Madam Chair, members of the commission, thank you. Delegate Reed, we have actively been working with stakeholders on ways that this program could be improved. I want to thank the folks at JLARC for allowing us to engage with them on this. We do feel strongly that in its current form, the program is not living up to its expectations, but that is largely, as JLARC has pointed out, due to the cumbersome and extensive administrative process that's required and the limited funding that's available per route award. In speaking extensively to airlines that have been interested in this program, both those who have utilized it and those who have not, and the airports that work with airlines to establish new service, it's very clear that by streamlining the administrative process and making the award amounts more meaningful, that this program could have a much broader impact and benefit to the Commonwealth. And we're prepared and eager to work with stakeholders to improve it.
Does that address your question? Yes. What implications does this have for even trying to attract any international flights?
It also does apply for international flights.
I'm sorry?
It does apply for international flights, and I can't remember. The grant award is larger for the international flight.
Reimbursement rate, I think, is $50,000
Yeah.
for international flights, so it's substantially higher, and I think they have awarded.
Maybe one or at least one international flight has gotten an award. Two. Okay.
Madam Chair, I would just say too, the other, as we understand it, the real intent of this is to ensure the success of the route once it's announced. Certainly, an announcement of new routes is very important, but raising the awareness that service is now available so that the community uses it and it becomes a profitable route for the airline and the service sticks, and we have long-term sustained route development in the Commonwealth really should be our goal. But international flights are eligible, but again, to our point, in terms of the route award, the relatively small amount of money that's available now compared to the marketing lift that would be required to educate a community about international service is really not where it should be.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
So turning to the next section, which is the media provider equipment exemption. Get to the right place in my, okay, there we go. So between fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 24, Virginia spent $64 million on the media provider equipment exemption. This exemption allows media companies like TV, broadcasting, cable TV, telecommunications, and now broadband companies to purchase eligible equipment free from the sales and use tax. The exemption was expanded to broadband equipment in 2022, and after that, the annual exempted amount doubled. So now it is estimated to be about $11 million per year as of fiscal year 24. We found that the exemption supports the expansion of communication infrastructure, but lacks strategic targeting. The exemption promotes investment in capital-intensive broadcasting and telecommunications equipment. And this is important because it also supports emergency alert and communication systems. Research has also found that decreased sales taxes on broadband equipment specifically is associated with increased investment in the equipment. However, the exemption, particularly for broadband equipment, is not well targeted. The exemption applies to all broadband investment, not just investment in underserved areas. Research also shows that the greatest economic and social benefits of broadband occur when an area first gains broadband access. The benefit is less when it's just upgrading from like 4G to 5G, for example. We also found that this exemption is not mentioned or factored into the state's broadband planning framework or documents. We found the exemption has negligible economic benefits per $1 million spent and a negligible return in revenue, and that's shown here on slide 50. We think a comprehensive review of the exemption's public benefits and structure should be conducted. The exemption, like many other sales tax exemptions for certain industries, was adopted for other purposes, not just economic development purposes. And these purposes include providing similar tax treatment to other industries and to not tax intermediate business inputs. This particular exemption also has public safety benefits, and those factors should all be weighed against the exemption's fiscal impact. Structural changes to the exemption should be considered as part of this review, including whether the broadband portion of the exemption should be separated from the traditional, like TV and radio communication portion of the exemption. Other states have tended to have them separate. The review should also consider whether the broadband exemption should be targeted to underserved areas. Again, right now, it is not. It's wherever the spending occurs, they can get the exemption. And also, it should consider whether it should be changed to a tax credit instead of an exemption. And essentially, tax credits typically allow you to better target the incentive, and it would also allow the tax department to have much clearer information about the fiscal impact. Slide 52 shows our recommendation for the Joint Subcommittee to evaluate tax preferences to conduct the review. So the last thing on this exemption, and this is whether it remains one exemption or it becomes two incentives, we think it should have an expiration date, which it currently does not. Expiration dates on incentives are a best practice to promote periodic legislative evaluation, and it would also align this exemption with the policies applied to other Virginia tax incentives. And slide 54 contains the recommendation to add an expiration date. And with that, Madam Chair, that's my, I do have one more slide, but that's the end of that section. Are there any questions related to that section or other sections?
Any questions?
No? Okay, so the last slide that I'll go over includes the list of our next round of incentives that we plan to review, unless you all have feedback for us. So this particular list contains the enterprise zone grants that we have evaluated before, and it also contains some new incentives that we have not evaluated in the past because they're not solely or mainly for economic development. So the historic rehabilitation tax credit and the neighborhood assistance tax credit are new to this list. They are some of Virginia's larger tax incentives, and we've added them, again, as from direction from the subcommittee last year. So we will be including some of these other larger incentives in our reviews going forward.
Okay. Questions? Thank you.
Thank you. And now I will introduce or turn the podium over to Stacy Henshaw.
That was for information, so there's no approval needed. And up next, we will have Stacy Henshaw, Auditor of Public Accounts, to provide us with some APA year results.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm Stacy Henshaw, the Auditor of Public Accounts, and I have with me today Zach Borgerding, and he is our Deputy Auditor for Human Capital and Operations, and will be assisting me in the presentation. Today, we are going to be reviewing our results from our prior work plan, and the areas that we are going to cover today are our local government oversight activities. I'm going to cover that information, and then Zach's going to cover information about our audit of the Commonwealth's financial statements, or what we call the ACFR, and our single audit of federal funds, as well as our higher education audits. And as you may remember last month, I had talked about that those are the main drivers of our work plan in terms of where we spend our time. And so moving on to our local government oversight activities. So this slide just gives you some basic information about what those activities are. We have two main projects that I talk about every year, spend a lot of time on, and that's our comparative report of local government revenues and expenses, as well as our fiscal distress analysis and monitoring. I wanted to briefly touch on some of our other oversight activities. We do not audit locality financial statements, and so I think sometimes that's something that people get confused about. We do have oversight over that process and provide information to them about accounting standards and that sort of thing, but we do not perform those audits. When I say oversight, one of the things that we do is issue annual audit specifications, and so this contains information about the auditing standards that have to be followed when they're audited by firms, as well as some unique items, things that are unique to Virginia that we require to be covered by the audit. We also perform quality control reviews of those audits, and so we want to make sure that the firms that are doing those reviews are doing them in accordance with the relevant standards. So we do go out every year and perform a sample of reviews. The other thing we do is we have a whole lot of information that's available on our website, and so in the process of gathering reports from local governments, from regional entities, we have a whole lot of information, and we make that available on our website along with some of our guidance documents. And so I have a picture here of a screenshot of our landing page for local government, our local government section on our website. And that ribbon there that's on the left-hand side is basically your guide for navigating that site. And so the top corner there is all the information that we provide that our office produces. So the comparative reports, fiscal distress monitoring. We also have our court audits located there, so the work that we do in the judicial system, and information that we provide to localities related to pension and OPEBs to assist them with their financial reports, and also our quality control reviews that we perform. In the middle section are reports that we get from others. So once again, this is all the financial statements and financial information that we gather from those localities. And in that bottom section is all the resources that we make available, such as our audit specifications, training, and presentations that we provide during the year. One of the reasons that I wanted to highlight our website today was to just make you aware of the potential impact of the new federal legislation related to web accessibility and the information that we provide on our website. And so, as you may be aware, there are new accessibility requirements related to state and local governments and the information that they publish on their websites and mobile applications. And Virginia also has a law that piggybacks on that as well. And so the federal regulations were supposed to be effective last month, but they have extended the effective date until 2027, just because there were a lot of entities that weren't ready and to be able to be prepared to have their websites meet these standards. Virginia's law, so there is some uncertainty right now as to whether or not Virginia state and local governments still have to meet the original date, because our law is built off of the original federal rule that is out there. And so a lot of us are still working towards meeting those federal accessibility standards, just because there's uncertainty as to Virginia, whether or not we still have to meet them because of our separate law. So the issue with this is right now we have over 5,500 documents out there that other entities have provided to us. And so we're allowed to archive those and include them out there. But we can't compel local governments to give us information that meets accessibility standards. There's no statute that says they have to do that with regard to financial reports. And so we are somewhat concerned that there may be a disconnect out there. They may be preparing to have their websites accessible, but they may not be thinking about the fact that financial reports that they provide to us would also need to be accessible as well. And so what I mean by that with regard to a financial report is there's certain fonts that you have to use. When you have tables or pictures, there's certain tags that you have to have on those. And so because we have voluntarily provided this information out there on our website just to make it available. We know people use it. It's a great one-stop shop. If you want to go look for financial statements for a locality in Virginia, you can go to our website. You don't have to search to find their website and find where it is. But there is, once again, nothing out there that's requiring that. And so we do have some concerns about whether or not in the future that we'll be able to continue to provide this information. I think there's some questions.
A couple of people who have some questions. You want to take them now?
Yes.
Okay, Delegate Price.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make sure, because I know the sponsor of the bill for the web accessibility at the state level is very excited about it. So would you need a potentially a carve out for information received, something like that, or what is the change that would be needed in order for you to still provide the service but be in alignment with the spirit of the law?
Right. So we could, and I'm going to look back to my local, because I know we've talked about this a little bit. We did think about that we could handle it by including in our audit specifications some information about meeting accessibility standards, and that would have to go through the APA, the public process, public comment process in terms of localities. There could be something that one of the things that we could have is right now there is legislation that says that these localities will provide these reports to us. So that legislation could be modified to say that it should be in a that information should meet accessibility standards. And so that would involve legislation to basically state that. And so that would be another way to do it.
Delegate Simon?
Madam Chair, I guess I'm a little confused about what's so hard about this. Are we talking about font sizes and things like that? I mean, are we really getting things in paper and scanning them and posting them, or do they come to us in electronic format? I mean, how difficult would it be to run it through a piece of software that says, convert this data to an accessible format before you publish it?
Right. And so because these are audited statements and they belong to the localities, that we don't believe that we should be changing their audited financial statements. And
like even the font sizes and things like that?
And so it's not always super easy to go through and do that. And so, but we are running them through, and we do have the ability to communicate with them and ask them to make the changes. And we are, we're communicating all of this right now to the localities and making information available to them to be able to do these scans themselves as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to our comparative report of local government. And so this is a report that we annually prepare where we compile financial information for all of Virginia's cities and counties, and 37 towns right now are required to have an annual audit. And those are towns that have a population greater than 3,500, as well as those that operate their own school system. And so it's the only comprehensive published source of locality financial data and information. We do think that we're the only state that has a product like this, where we have all of the Commonwealth's financial activity for their localities in one report. It's uniform because we do set the standards for the information that they provide to us. It looks different than their financial reports. There is some flexibility into how they pull together information for their own financial statements. And so that's why this information is unique. It makes it, the process that we have for collecting it makes it comparative. And we do know it's used by localities, other decision makers. I know the Commission on Local Government uses this data as well. And so we do think that it is widely used by Virginia citizens and, like I said, decision makers. I have a few slides in here that just shows some examples of our exhibits, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, flip through these very quickly. Just to point out this main slide, which is Exhibit A, and I know there's a lot of information up here, so.
I don't think it meets accessibility standards, I will tell you.
But, so just to let you know, this report will have to meet accessibility standards. Now, when you access it on our website, you can make it much larger and so in an electronic format. But yes, as I talk about accessibility, I put this report up here that has teeny information on it. But the one thing that I'll say is Exhibit A is your crosswalk, and so that gives high-level information about revenues and expenses. And across the top, you'll see references to other exhibits. And so there are 18 different exhibits, and you can basically drill down and get information about local government, revenues and expenses in a whole lot of different ways. And so to gather data on the activity. This is just cities. We have counties and towns as well. You'll see some blank lines. The reason there are blank lines is that there are localities that have not reported information to us. And so we still include a line for them, but the blank line basically means they haven't given us the data. And so this is just an example of revenue. And so this is at the local level. This is general property taxes, which is the largest revenue stream. We have Exhibit B2, which would give additional information on local taxes. You can drill down into revenues they receive from the Commonwealth, from the federal government as well. And so, like I said, a whole lot of information that would not otherwise be available if you're looking at their financial statements. On the expense side, we have a general exhibit that includes a lot of information by function, but then you can drill down further. I put education in here. That's the largest expenditure item. So you can look at how much they spend on instruction. You can look at what they spend on people transportation. And then to the far right of that would also show external funding, other funding besides tax and general fund funding, like funding they get from the Commonwealth for education and for federal government. So there's a wealth of information in here about financial activity. Statutorily, we're required to report this information by February 15th. This year we were missing data for 52 localities as of February 15th. When we published our report at the end of April, we were still missing 32 localities. And those localities are listed here on the screen. This is the most that we've ever been missing. Last year we issued our report on April 7th, and so we were a couple of weeks, 2 weeks later this year in issuing it, And last year, we had 30 localities that were missing, and so it's gone up just a little bit. But that trend is that it just continues to go up. So we've never kind of turned that trend around where it goes down. The primary reason that we're still hearing from everyone is just resources and not being able to get accounting and finance resources. While a lot of the localities don't compile their own financial statements, they have to have their accounting records complete in order for the firms to come in and do the audits and compile the financial statements for them. We have received 5 additional localities in as of the end of May. So right now we have 27 localities that remain delayed. There's also a requirement that if a locality is delayed, they're supposed to post this on their website as well as the reason for the delay. For 11 of those 27 localities, we didn't see any notification on their website, although 8 of those have corresponded with us regarding their delay. We will eventually go back and add this data to the report, but because the data impacts a whole lot of figures, it's not just easy of adding at one locality in. Because we have per capita data and averaging, it impacts the entire report. And so for quality control purposes, we wait until later, until we have most of the information in to publish an amended report. And so this just shows some trends. So the initial deadline is 12/15 when they're supposed to have this information to us. As of 12/15, only 78 of the Commonwealth's localities that have to report to us had information. So that means over 50% were late and did not meet that first deadline. And then by the published deadline, we have another 40 come in. By the initial published deadline, the 2/15, we had another 40 come in. And then we had another 25 come in before we published. So the one thing that I'll point out is in 2020, the deadline was changed from November 30th to December 15th. So they got an extra 2 weeks. And prior to 2020, we went back and we're looking at some stats. We pretty much only had a handful of localities that were late getting us information. And so it really varied, but pretty much we're never got above 5 or 6 that were late. And so it was 2021, when we started seeing this trend in late submissions to our office. And at the same time, I'll just say there has been a national trend where there's been a shortage of accountants. I mean, we experience it in our office. State government agencies experience too. So this is really part of a national trend. The good news is eventually they get them to us. But when we don't have this information, it makes it hard for us to do fiscal distress monitoring because we do that based on financial data that we receive for them.
Delegate Price has a question.
Okay.
Thank you. And just trying to connect what the missing reports with the previous conversation. So if the missing reports are potentially due to shortages in staff and resources in getting them done, and then we say, and oh, by the way, it needs to be accessible, does that mean that it could be that you would get more reports late? And the reason why I'm asking is because I understand you're the publisher of the information, they're the maker of the information, so we were just discussing, so whose responsibility is it to make it accessible? Just trying to see who would it be easier to help get it done.
Right, and so in terms of, and I mean, I guess we would have to look into that in terms of, once again, because they're audited financial statements and they have an opinion of a firm that is put on those, that's why we are hesitant to be actually making changes to those financial statements. And but with that said, we can scan it and communicate with them and say, these are the things that are problems. Can you fix them for us? Certainly, it would not have to delay us putting the information in the comparative report or running it through our fiscal distress model. It just would delay potentially it going on our website. And so there is a difference, and it's primarily that it wouldn't be out there and available for somebody to pull from our website. And we're going to keep outreach. I mean, we're doing presentations. We have slides in our presentations where we're continuing to communicate about this with localities. This slide, in addition to this year delays for 2025 reporting, this slide just summarizes the information that's still outstanding on previous years. And so the first three lines, those localities have gotten us all of their financial reports, but they did not submit to us transmittal data. And that data is the data that we use for the comparative report. And so I'll point out Hopewell. So we haven't had data from them from transmittals for 7 years now. So they haven't been in the comparative report for the last 7 years. The city of Norton, we've had 4 years now that we haven't had data for them to include. And so, well, and I guess 5 maybe if you count this fiscal year 2025. The good news about Hopewell that I'll say is that they are up to date on their financial report. So that is a success story because they were way behind on their financial report. So they have been able to provide that information. It's just the transmittal process. We have several localities, Warren and the towns of Big Stone Gap, Broadway, and Benton that are behind on their financial reports and their transmittal data. And so once again, this just prevents us from being able to do fiscal distress monitoring for those localities and for them to actually have data, about their overall results as well. So if there are no further questions on the comparative report process, I'm going to move to our local distress monitoring. And this is, once again, is a statutory requirement for our office to perform this monitoring as part of an early warning system to identify potential distress. We have two components, a quantitative analysis as well as a qualitative analysis. And so quantitative analysis, we basically take their financial statements, we run them through 12 different financial ratios. We analyze that. We look for trends in that data. From a qualitative perspective, we look at demographics. We look at other non-financial factors. And we also look at timeliness in financial reporting. And that is a statutory requirement now for us to report if a locality is delayed. We also have to provide, or statutorily required to provide, assistance to the Commission on Local Government. They had some new requirements that went into effect after the 2024 General Assembly session that basically has them providing oversight for monitoring localities that have been deemed to be in fiscal distress. We've been working with them this year with the town of Tangier, and so we continue to provide assistance from that perspective. So for 2024 and 2025 monitoring, this covered fiscal year 2023 and 2024 financial data from localities. We basically had 3 localities that we initially identified and as potentially being in fiscal distress. And so that was the city of Radford, the town of Tangier, and the county of Charles City. I'm going to skip through these. This, once again, is just talking about Big Stone Gap and Warren and Benton and Broadway being delayed. And so once again, we can't do monitoring for them. But moving on to the ones that we did identify, with Charles City, we had noticed some downward trends. We communicated with management and they did submit. The second part of our process is completing a financial assessment questionnaire, and they did that. But did not formally request for us to participate in any further follow-up. So what that basically means is we had the questionnaire, but we didn't have the opportunity to meet with management and ask questions about the data or gather any additional data. Since then, since the 2025 data has come in, we've noticed improvement. In fact, their ratios have improved and they're no longer exceeding our threshold. And so we also know that they're working with financial advisors to come up with a plan. They're also undergoing a forensic audit. And so based on the fact that we are seeing improvement and we know they're already working on their financial issues, we didn't see anything unique or elevated factors that we felt like would make the Charles City meet the definition of fiscal distress, but we will continue to monitor them. The city of Radford, we had been monitoring for some time. We did analysis on them a few years back. And so we noted continued declines in their thresholds, in their ratio points, and they had exceeded our thresholds. for some time now. We sent notification to them in November, again, about the results and about doing additional review. They did complete the questionnaire and participated in our follow-up review process. And based on that process, we did conclude that they met the criteria for fiscal distress. And there are two primary reasons for that. And one is just dealing with sustaining a structurally balanced budget. They've had issues with their revenue projections and then also some uncertainty in their billing and revenue collections. One of the things that happened as a college town, they had some population declines as less students came back after COVID. And so based on that, they experienced some additional declines in revenue that they didn't build into their projections. They also have issues related to unpaid liabilities for purchasing wholesale electricity to run their city's electric operations. And that's something that's really been a strain on their general revenues. So in March of 2026, we issued a formal recommendation to the governor and legislative committees. And right now, the Commission on Local Government is just waiting a decision as to whether or not there will be approved a plan for state assistance for the city of Radford. So I talked about Tangier last year, and so this is a small town. They don't prepare financial statements, but we received some notifications regarding them not paying vendors, not paying their debt payments, not providing federal reports. And so based on that, we qualitatively identified them as potentially being in fiscal distress. They did participate in our process in July. We did conclude that they met the definition of being fiscally distressed, and so we made a formal recommendation for state assistance. In November, state officials approved the plan. In January, the Commission on Local Government began monitoring and providing the process, and an external turnaround specialist has been in there reviewing trying to determine what the issues are and come up with recommendations. We have some information in here about their report. They issued a report in March of 2026 and basically have identified 4 issues main issues that the town needs to address, and made some recommendations related to addressing those issues. In May, the Commission issued a letter to the governor and legislative committees to give the first periodic update, and they're going to continue to monitor their progress in implementing those recommendations. Now, I do know that Tangier has also reached out to the Commission of Local Government about receiving some additional state assistance with regard to hiring a town manager. They don't have a town manager right now, and just getting some additional fiscal training for their town council. I've already talked about Hopewell. So small town audits, just very briefly, right now, small towns that have a population under 3,500 are not required to have an annual audit. They still may have to have an audit based on debt covenants. Any small town that voluntarily elects to have an audit is required to submit that report to our office. We're only getting about 20 to 25 a year, and so that's only about 15% of the small towns in Virginia. It's really hard to get an audit. We don't have a lot of local government audit providers in Virginia. It's expensive for them. So we're not sure if it's just that they are trying to get an audit and can't get one, or if they've just made a decision not to get one because of the cost associated with it. And so I know we often get a lot of questions about having people looking for town financial information, and we just don't have it. We often don't even have contacts to be able to contact someone and ask if they have information. We do go out and try to look at websites and see if we can find those reports. But that's something that we continue to receive inquiries about. And the last thing I'm going to cover before I turn it over to Zach is just basically and I talked about this last year, we continue to get a lot of inquiries from citizens about local governments. A lot of times it is about small towns and smaller local governments. And they communicate a variety of concerns to us: policy and budget decisions, fiscal management, conflict of interest, lack of transparency and accountability. There isn't an IG function for local governments. The State Inspector General doesn't have oversight from a local perspective, and there's very little that we can do. Statutorily, we're limited to special circumstances, and that would include fraud or inappropriate handling of funds and primarily state funds. Or a local governing body could vote to have the APA perform an audit, but we don't necessarily have the resources to do those audits. We have a small local shop at our office, and in that case, JLARC would still have to approve, since you approve our work plan as well. And so this is more so making you aware of this, just in the event that you ever hear from your constituents that they've contacted our office and basically that we've let them know we don't have oversight. If we can direct them somewhere, we do. So if we're aware of a place to that if they're asking a question and we know of some resources, we do. But in a lot of cases, it's more so about management or concerns about decisions that have been made or perceived fraud at the local level. And so anyway, so that once again is just providing some information.
Senator Dees has a question, and then Delegate Reed.
Ma'am, I'm concerned that you don't know, if people aren't giving you the information, if you don't have access to the information, there's probably fraud out there that you can't discover. I'm looking at page, or slide 15, these localities that haven't provided you information. Last year, Bob McCabe, who's an economist down at Old Dominion, gave the Senate Finance Committee a report that indicated that, for example, the city of Norton, which is on this list, is the most dependent locality in the state on state funding. That would indicate there's some level of fiscal distress there to me. And if they're not giving you information, you can't make that determination. I'm just wondering what sort of tools you think you would need to be able to get information.
Well, we'll point out that Norton were delayed in getting, they did get their financial report to us, but not transmittal data. But it's really hard. I know over the years, at times there's been legislation that's been proposed that would have a fiscal penalty for not providing information timely. But if you have a locality that's having problems getting information, paying for an audit or hiring resources, then that we don't believe that necessarily is the right avenue to go. The one thing that was added was the notification requirement, so that at least from the citizens are aware of the fact that their locality hasn't provided this information. And so that's the notification that I talked about, where they're supposed to publish on their websites that they have not provided the financial information to us, to build in accountability into that process. I know VML has been very helpful in reaching out to localities and reminding them about the deadlines. I know initially with Tangier, when they had issues, they had some people that were available, a specialist that went out and did some initial assessment for them as well. So I don't necessarily have the answer for that, and I know that's incredibly frustrating. And in terms of why we continue to see some of these delays, or, with the small towns, I think it's probably a resource issue. I know I recently saw something where one of them had like $1 million budget, and they had a audit price that was quoted at $15,000. So, I mean, from a standpoint of, are you going to pay $15,000 to cover $1 million budget? I mean, that if you're competing with other resources, that I think it's seen as being something of, kind of a low tier item to address there. I know one of the things that we've talked about is looking to see if there are other opportunities for them besides having a full audit and other types of things that could be done. And that's something our office is willing to work with local groups on to kind of come up with an alternative that at least gives some idea of whether or not they have the right fiscal controls in place and what their financial activity looks like. And so I know one of the things that we talked about is at least trying to, once again, a few years back, we did a survey along with VML, I think, just to know who actually was still doing financial statements and that they just hadn't made their way to us. And so just trying to look for some more outreach to figure out what's the issue there, and is it really just a monetary issue, and are there some solutions?
Delegate Reed?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. And Stacy, thanks for the information. And just kind of following on to what Senator Deeds was kind of asking, at what point does the fiscal distress of these localities then become a appropriations concern of the Commonwealth?
So at the point, so there is so if they go through the fiscal distress process and go through the complete follow-up review with our office, then there are funds that are available to assist them with their remediation efforts, and so to assist in terms of helping them to determine what the issues are and whether or not, and what things they can put in place to actually address those issues. And we've seen success from that standpoint. Bristol is an example of one that was fiscally distressed and went through in the process and was able to turn it around. And when we talked about Hopewell, their main issue was related to being able to pull the financial information together. And so they've also received assistance to help them to be able to do that. And so now they still have a material weakness on their financial statements, but they have a clean opinion, but they're still having issues in terms of their controls and their control process, and is still receiving, I believe, some assistance related to that.
Madam Chair, just to follow up, but like with the example with Tangier, where you were getting reports of vendors not being paid, or if the locality is not able to meet their obligations, is there a time when that then becomes an obligation of the Commonwealth?
I don't think so, or
It would depend on
it's
the debt and the state intercept clause, but that would not apply to Tangier.
right. And so there is a state intercept clause in that if they're not paying their debt, that state funding that's coming down from the state can be pulled to pay that debt. And so, but in a way, it's probably more of a moral obligation if they weren't providing basic services or able to serve their citizens, that the state would step in and assist from that perspective. Okay.
Morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm Zach Borgening, Deputy Auditor for Human Capital and Operations. I'll be picking up where Stacy left off. And so, in addition to local government oversight, we've also completed our annual audit of the statewide financial statements and single audit of federal funds. Over the next few slides, I would like to highlight some of the themes and findings resulting from that work and individually touch on a few of the more significant findings. So we'll start with non-IT findings. This is a breakdown that should look familiar to those of you who were on the commission last year. The top areas, again, federal awards, where the Commonwealth spent nearly $32 billion in expenditures in fiscal year 2025. As the Commonwealth depends on this funding, we pointed out 16 findings on areas agencies need to improve to comply with the requirements that go along with that funding. Again, financial accounting and reporting came in second. And the last category worth mentioning on this slide is employee offboarding. Most of these findings deal with basic things like collecting equipment, removing access. We did have one finding where we identified 2 employees where the agency didn't remove the employees from the payroll, and actually they were paid $26,000 after being separated. And so that's just an example that illustrates the importance of these offboarding controls. That brings us to what is consistently our biggest finding area, information system security. We have recently started receiving some resistance from agencies on the degree of our IT security procedures. And so we just want to take this opportunity to give you some background on why we prioritize this area, as well as our audit approach to IT. And so to do that, I want to provide some background going back to the early 2000s, so going back a ways back post Y2K. General Assembly recognized the rapidly changing threat landscape in technology and adopted a joint resolution for our office to perform a statewide review over data and databases. And the results of that review were pretty informative. We found that some of our smaller agencies didn't have an information security program at all. Only 20% had adopted an adequate security program in accordance with industry best practices, and so we really had a long way to go. And by 2012, through VITA oversight in our audits, at that point, at least all agencies had an adequate documented security program. And so fast forwarding to current day, since that time, we've continued to make system security a priority to ensure that agencies not only have a program or kind of the framework, but that they're actually complying with those programs and executing those controls, because that's what really protects the Commonwealth. And so auditing standards have also recently included more direct requirements over our responsibilities to audit general IT controls, and you need to look no further than the news to see recent high-profile breaches to understand the importance of system security. And so we see our work in this area operating twofold, both to support our audit opinions, but also to protect the Commonwealth. While we've made great progress since the early 2000s, we continue to find opportunities for improvement in several IT control families, the most significant of which being access control, risk management, audit and accountability, and configuration management. So this slide gives you a picture of findings by agency. Health and Human Resources continues to have the most findings, with 40 findings coming from 3 agencies. Diving deeper into the HHR Secretariat, you can see here the finding trends by agency. Most areas remain consistent or actually slightly improved in some cases, while IT findings at health have been increasing since 2023, so perhaps a trend to pay attention to there. So that so far has been more of a macro analysis over our statewide audits, and so from here I'd like to pivot and specifically highlight a few of the material weaknesses we issued this year, material weakness being that most severe category of finding that we issue. And so starting with the single audit, I'll start with social services. 2 long-time material weaknesses here involving subrecipient monitoring and inaccurate federal performance reporting, including errors in 50% of the cases reviewed for performance reporting. And that agency also still has 23 findings in their most recent report. So I think there's a lot of work left to be done there. But I do want to make another point, and that's that last year we issued, or we included a 3rd material weakness over IT governance and a risk alert that essentially said we thought the agency was heading in the wrong direction in terms of finding severity and the length of their corrective action. And since that report, management has worked with consultants to reduce ongoing findings by 30% and has reduced the severity of our prior finding over IT governance. So we're encouraged by this. We think that they are taking this seriously and that they're working through it. And we're hopeful that the 2026 audit will prove out a continuation of that trend. We also issued a new finding to Wildlife Resources in which the degree of unsupported journal entries and drawdowns and accounting errors we thought represented a material weakness in financial management of grants. Same theme here from what I talked through last year, and it kind of gets back to what Stacy was talking about with staffing or accountant shortages. That they experienced turnover in some key financial positions and didn't have written procedures for new staff to follow. And so talent management and continuity of operations during turnover continue to be significant issues for many state agencies. In our audit of energy, we identified a material weakness in controls over payroll costs charged to federal grants. In this case, the federal grant sponsors expect not only to charge payroll to the grant based on what was budgeted on the front end, but to have controls in place to ensure that the actual time and effort is there to support the allowability of those costs. And so we've encouraged energy to make sure that they're allocating additional resources to make sure they have those controls in place. So moving along to our ACFR audit, we issued 2 material weaknesses over financial reporting. We again reissued a material weakness to DHRM involving material misstatements in multiple line items. In the prior year, they had turnover, lack of policy, similar to what we just discussed. Since that time, they've hired staff, they've begun developing policies, and I think this is a case where it just takes time for staff to settle into those roles and to mature those policies and procedures, and so they're continuing to work on that corrective action. That brings us to VEC, where we issued a new material weakness related to accounts receivable, both the accuracy of it and their collection procedures. Turnover policies. One added element here in terms of the cause there was a lack of communication. A lot of times with our larger agencies and institutions, breaking down those silos between divisions can be a challenge. The only thing other thing that I would mention here at VEC is they do deal with a lot of sensitive data as well as automated systems. And we have several IT security findings, including a governance finding due to the significant backlog of deficiencies that they're not only to address from us, but also from internal audit and other external entities. And so this finding does align with their ongoing effort to modernize organizational structures, technology governance, and risk management practices. And so pretty significant IT overhaul going on over there, and we look forward to seeing how that corrective action develops. So based on the results of our ACFR audit, we did reissue our multi-year risk alert regarding financial reporting. The concern here being that we want to make sure that we can issue audited statewide financial statements, or the ACFR, by the code mandated deadline, December 15th. And so as you look at the graphic, there is some, one thing that I would say is these dollar amounts are gross and not necessarily the effect on the bottom line. Some of those are reclassifications, but the numbers are large. And so there is cautious room for optimism here. As you can see, the dollar amounts and the material misstatements actually improved from the prior year. The trade-off that we had there was that in some cases, in order to get the information in the state it needed to be, some agencies took more time, which increased the delays, and that compresses the time that accounts has to compile the information and that we have to audit it. And so, again, cautious optimism here with more work to do. And so the last section I'll touch on briefly is higher education, as these audits make up approximately half of our work plan. As of today, we have 9 audits that are either issued or in the wrap-up stage, and 6 audits that are ongoing, which we plan to issue later this summer. In most of our ongoing audits, financial reporting weaknesses have contributed, at least to some extent, in our audit delays. And so I'll start with Longwood. This report came out just, I believe, just a couple of weeks ago. And in that report, we issued a material weakness concerning related party transactions with its real estate foundation. In looking at the statements, we feel like they're exhibiting some signs of financial weakness and limited liquidity. And in some cases, Longwood relied on transfers and arrangements with its foundation to meet obligations, but didn't always properly account and disclose for those transactions. And so we've recommended the university to put controls in place to ensure that when they have those transactions, they make sure they have formal written agreements around them, and to make sure they're paying attention to the accounting and the disclosure of those related party transactions. We've also repeated a material weakness over financial reporting at Norfolk State. As the university was working to address this finding after our 2023 audit, they lost several key people that were working on those corrective actions, and I think that set them back. When we started the 2024 audit, it was 8 months after year end, before the statements were available to be audited. We had a similar experience so far this year for fiscal year 25, and really got off to a slow start on that audit. It's starting to move along now, and so we are hopeful that by the end of the summer, we can get something issued so that you can have a better picture of where that finding is. And so the last university that I'll point out here is George Mason. This is a little bit of a separate issue. From a financial reporting and accounting perspective, they do a nice job, but this is more of a niche issue as a potential scope limitation. And so to give you some background, during our fiscal 24 audit, we became aware of high risk factors regarding a sensitive sponsored program in which Mason subcontracted work to a private company. Initially, both Mason and the sponsor were cooperating with us and getting us the information that we asked for. But then as we asked for additional support, eventually the sponsor and the subcontractor directed Mason to restrict our access to that financial information. And so in the absence of support, we relied on a confirmation from the sponsor for fiscal year 24. But we did issue a comment to management that said, hey, in advance of next year, you need to take a look at your programs, even these sensitive ones, and make sure that there's the opportunity for oversight and that the programs can be audited. And so while Mason did work to establish an LLC with the intention of eventually moving some of this activity under that company's purview, we really didn't see where they took other tangible steps to prepare for the fiscal year 25 audit. And so during this audit, we selected expenses from two sponsors, both the same sponsor we had the issues with in 24, as well as additional sponsor with a similar subcontracting arrangement totaling $45 million in annual expenses. So we were talking about big contracts here. And in response to our request for unclassified information, Mason reached out to its sponsors and we believe incorrectly asserted before consulting with legal counsel that providing our office support would be considered public dissemination requiring approval from the sponsor. So we didn't really see a state university providing its state auditor unclassified support in accordance with state law to be public dissemination. But under that, once the sponsor had that kind of criteria, they have denied our access to any additional financial information. There's one sponsor we're continuing to have some dialogue with difficulties. Another one has essentially shut down the conversation. And so we continue to have dialogue with Mason about next steps, but do not currently have a viable path forward and without additional evidence cannot provide an opinion on the university's financial statements.
Senator Dees has a question.
By federal sponsor, you mean a federal agent, an agency of the federal government?
Correct.
And Madam Chair, I assume that agencies of the federal government also do work with other institutions, Fire Ed, Oregon, and Virginia, and you've not experienced the same kind of denial of information from those other schools?
So that's a great question, Senator Dees. And so what I would say is I would have to imagine that they do. Now, I would say we haven't run into this situation before, and so I can't say whether or not it's an apples to apples that we have happened to select the contracts that had this type of information. Some universities may also have separate legal entities like what Mason's getting ready to set up that actually aren't under our purview. And so for these, and this is Department of War kind of those types of programs. And so it's unclear to me at this point, and Stacy, I don't know if it's unclear to me how much of that is out there. But hopefully that somewhat answers your question.
Yeah, and like Zach said, we feel like that this started by characterizing us as being public dissemination, and we don't believe that providing information to us for audit is public dissemination. And once that term was used with the sponsor, that's, at that point that they indicated that they're not allowed to publicly disseminate this information. So it's not like they received a FOIA request for this information. It was coming through a government agency that performs their audit. And we have the ability to, if something is unclassified but still could be sensitive, to house that information in a special place in our work, and be careful about the type of information that we include on our website.
And Madam Chair, that wouldn't be FOIable if they provided it to you, would it?
if it is sensitive, it would retain its sensitive classification. So we do have the ability, for example, all the IT information that we receive from the agencies we audit is considered as unfoyable. And so we keep that in a separate place and we mark it as being sensitive. And so we do have the ability to do that. Now, at this time, we have reached out to our legal representation at the OAG just to talk to them about whether or not providing information to us is public dissemination, because that seems to be the issue there. And so the one thing that I want to point out is, regardless of whether we don't necessarily believe that them using funneling all of this activity through an LLC that wouldn't be subject to our review is the answer to this, because those auditors should also be reviewing that information. And one could say a government auditor is less of public dissemination than providing it to an auditor that is just a firm. And so we don't, right, like Zach mentioned, that was initially one of the things that was proposed as a solution, but we didn't necessarily believe that that's a solution to the oversight from that standpoint.
And I will add that I do believe that they communicated there were other reasons that they also thought they would get benefits from that entity that they were creating, just to make clear that really wasn't the only reason that it was created. But and just to give you a little more context on the detail of the situation, really this public dissemination thing is it's a DD 254 provision in the contract with the sponsor that essentially says, before you can provide this information publicly, you have to come ask for support, because then we can review it and elevate it to a higher classification level. And so I don't think that it ever should have been triggered, but once it went to the sponsor, they elevated it to unclassified information to controlled unclassified information, which is still unclassified. You can take CUI trainings, which we've done, but just gives you a little more information on how that conversation has progressed.
Delegate Herring.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. The subcontractor referenced here, is that the LLC or is the subcontractor a private entity?
That's a private company.
Madam Chair, second question. Do I dare ask, what's the private company? I mean, let's just... Are we allowed to even, I'm just curious, I'm sure others are too.
Discussion over, and I appreciate that's a great question.
Yeah.
Mary, and I'd love to get you some more information on
Okay.
that. I'd just like to double check and just given the nature
Fair enough.
of the question around
Fair enough. Thank you, Madam Chair.
our treatment of the information. Thank you. And if there are no further questions right now, I have just a couple quick slides here and we'll finish up. So this slide just gives you a broad picture of the number of findings by university. Just remembering that not all findings are created equal, but it does give you a snapshot. This slide gives you a snapshot of the federal student financial assistance findings that were ongoing as of the end of fiscal 25 from our 24 audit. And what I wanted to end with is we always think it's important to share with you our concerns as to what we're seeing in the Commonwealth, but we also like to take the opportunity to share good news when we have it. Last year, we discussed with you a material weakness at the University of Virginia that had been in place for a few years, and it wasn't because management wasn't taking the problem seriously, but it was because it took time to fix the problem the right way. And so in fiscal 25, UVA really began to see the fruits of their efforts in that area based on the reduction in findings, their material weakness being reduced to really a much smaller niche issue. And so we really see an improved internal control environment overall at that university. And similarly, DGS and VITA both received downgrades in prior material weaknesses as a result of the substantial effort and progress they've made in addressing their issues. And so we just believe these success stories serve as a great example for other agencies when they find themselves in these material weaknesses and these severe findings, that with sticking with it and allocating the resources, they can work their way out of it. So that concludes our presentation, Madam Chair. Are there any additional questions that we can answer?
Delegate Price.
Thank you. Can you go back to slide 57?
Certainly.
Can you talk more about I guess, what if any impact this is having on students?
Certainly, that's an excellent question. So I would say in terms of the impact on the students' experience currently, there has been, to my knowledge, no impact. And so I really think that a lot of our findings are around things like enrollment reporting. Now they do put, if you have these issues outstanding long enough and the sponsor starts to take a big enough issue with it, it can jeopardize future funding. And so that's the risk here, and that's why we continue to point these findings out to make sure that they get corrected. But I would say also that pretty much any time that we've tested student financial aid, we have the same types of findings crop up. They usually stick around for a few years, and we've never had the sponsor, Department of Education take, significant financial actions or consequences because of that. So I don't know if you would add anything.
Madam Chair.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Yeah,
and then the other question I had, so if the numbers are coming from 2025, what, if any, communication have you had with the new administration, and how does that work so that they're aware of previous material findings from the previous administration?
Another great question. And so we do try to reach out to incoming administrators. And what I would say is each year we have a process where we have members of our management team that will have meetings with the secretaries and the chief of staff, and just to try to talk through what their concerns are throughout the Commonwealth, to try to give them an update on where we are and what we're seeing, and to try to understand how we can help support the administration as best as we can from an audit perspective. And so we do have dialogue. Certainly.
Any additional questions? Okay.
One final thing
Thank
that
you
I'll
again.
pass along.
Okay, Stacey.
It is that for our new members, we recently added all of you to our weekly distribution list, and so be alert for that. And so each week we send an email that has information in it about the reports that we've issued for the previous week. And so if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on those reports.
Again, thank you for the presentation and the information, and I'll now turn it back over to Hal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That concludes today's agenda. The next meeting of the commission will be Monday, July the 6th. On the agenda will be VRS and Commonwealth Savers. In addition to hearing staff oversight updates, you'll hear from the leadership of both VRS and Commonwealth Savers. Thank you for your attention this morning.
If there's no further business to come before JLARC, we will adjourn this meeting, and we'll see you on July 6th.
Thank you.
Morning, maybe.